see you.
Avatar: Fire and Ash is now streaming on Disney+. It's the film critics are calling the best Avatar yet.
Yeah! Go, 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 go!
A true epic and completely jaw-dropping.
This is the only pure thing in this world.
Return to Pandora on Disney+.
It will be an adventure for the whole family.
And watch the Oscar-winning phenomenon at home.
This is sick!
Avatar: Fire and Ash, now streaming on Disney+. Rated PG-13.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
The Indus Valley Civilization, the discovery that changed history. History does not often allow for quiet revolutions. Most of the time, the past reveals itself in fragments, broken inscriptions, scattered ruins, the slow accumulation of clues that eventually reshape what we think, what we know. But every so often, the ground opens and something vast emerges all at once, something that does not fit. In the early 20th century, under the authority of John Marshall, a series of excavations began in what was then British India. The work was methodical, almost routine at first. Archaeology in the region had long been focused on tracing the known contours of history. Buddhist sites, later urban areas, inscriptions tied to empires already recorded in texts. There was no expectation that anything fundamentally new would be uncovered. And yet, in the plains of Punjab and Sindh, something was waiting. At Harappa, excavators began to uncover brick structures, well-fired, uniform, and laid out with a precision that suggested planning rather than chance accumulation. Not far away at Mohenjo-daro, the scale expanded dramatically. Streets appeared, not winding paths, but straight lines, intersections at right angles, drains running under the roads, covered, engineered, and intentional. At first, the finds was misread. It was assumed that these were relatively late constructions, perhaps tied to known historical periods. But the deeper the excavations went, the more the assumption began to fail. The artifacts did not match, the stratigraphy did not align. The material culture, pottery, seals, tools spoke of something older, much older. By the mid-1920s, the realization became unavoidable. These cities were not late. They were ancient contemporary with the great civilization of Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. A third pillar of early urban civilization had been uncovered, not through texts or preserved memory, but through brick and silence. And yet from the very beginning, something was wrong, or rather, something was missing. When archaeologists uncover a civilization of this scale, there are certain expectations, patterns so consistent across human history that they are almost taken for granted. There should be kings. There should be monuments to power. There should be inscriptions that proclaim victories, divine authority, lineage, conquest. There should be temples rising above the urban landscape, marking the presence of gods and the rulers who served them. At Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, those expectations dissolved. There were no towering palaces dominating the cities, no massive temples carved with scenes of divine kingship, no statues of rulers gazing out over their domains, no inscriptions declaring the achievements of a monarch, no carved reliefs of armies marching into battle, no lists of conquered peoples. Instead, there were bricks, uniform bricks, standardized to such a degree that they appeared interchangeable across hundreds of kilometers. Cities built not around a central palace, but around a grid. Infrastructure that prioritized water management, sanitation, and order. Drainage systems so advanced that in some respects, they would not be matched again until the rise of Rome. It was not that the Indus cities lacked sophistication, quite the opposite. They were, by very measurable standards, among the most advanced urban centers of the Bronze Age. But their sophistication expressed itself differently, quietly, systematically, without spectacle. This was the first clue. The second came with scale. As more sites were identified, not just Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, but dozens, then hundreds, the outline of the civilization expanded. It stretched across what is now Pakistan and northwest India, covering an area of roughly 1 million square kilometers. This was not a regional culture. It was a vast, interconnected system of cities, towns, and settlements, all sharing the same architectural logic, the same material standards, the same underlying order. And still, no kings. The absence became harder to ignore. In Mesopotamia, even the earliest city-states left behind records of rulers' names pressed into clay tablets in cuneiform, recounting building projects, trade agreements, wars. In Egypt, the pharaohs immortalized themselves in stone. Their images and hieroglyphs carved into monuments that still dominate the landscape. But here, on one of the largest civilizations of the ancient world, there was nothing of the kind. Instead, archaeologists found small objects, seals carved from steatite, often depicting animals, bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, creatures rendered with a precision that suggested both artistic skill and symbolic meaning. Above these animals, short sequences of signs, an undeciphered script, repeated across thousands of artifacts. These seals were clearly important. They were standardized, widely distributed, and likely used in a trade or administration. But they did not name kings. They did not recount battles. They did not proclaim divine authority. They remained silent. It is here that the Indus Valley Civilization begins to shift from discovery to enigma. Because the question is not simply what has been found, but what has not. Absence in archaeology is not always meaningful. Sometimes things are simply lost, destroyed by time, erosion, later occupation, but the Indus case is different. The absence is systematic. It repeats across site after site, layer after layer. The same patterns emerge not once, but consistently. No royal tombs filled with wealth and sacrifice, no centralized monuments designed to protect power. No visual culture of domination, no clear evidence of a ruling class that sought to immortalize itself. And yet this civilization functioned. Cities were planned, resources were managed, trade networks extended far beyond the Indus region, reaching into Mesopotamia itself. Standardization was maintained across vast distances, implying some form of coordination, some mechanism of control or agreement. Order existed, but its source remains invisible.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Want to elevate your travel experience? Here's how. With a Delta SkyMiles Reserve American Express card, you can relax before your flight in the Delta Sky Club with up to 15 visits per medallion year. And now through July 15th, 2026, you can earn up to 125,000 bonus miles, so you're closer to your next adventure. The Delta SkyMiles Reserve card. Check out the new design at www.delta.com/Spotify. Minimum spending requirements and terms apply.
This is the paradox that defines the Indus Valley Civilization from the moment of its rediscovery. It's not simply that we do not understand it, it's that it appears to contradict the models we use to understand all other early civilizations. For over a century, scholars have tried to resolve this tension. Some have suggested that the kings did not exist, but ruled in ways that did not leave monumental traces. Others propose that power was decentralized and that authority may have been distributed among councils, merchant groups, or religious institutions that did not express themselves through grand architecture. There are even arguments that the civilization represents a fundamentally different model of urban life. one in which order was maintained not through visible hierarchy, but through shared systems, standards, and practices. But these remain interpretations. The evidence itself does not speak clearly enough to confirm them. And so we are left with something rare in the study of ancient history. Not a civilization that has been forgotten, but a civilization that refuses to explain itself. It sits at the foundation of urban human development, equal in age and scale to the great societies of the ancient world, and yet operating according to principles that remain obscured. It challenges the assumption that complexity requires kings, that cities require monuments to power, that order must be imposed from above and recorded for posterity. Because here, in the dust of the Indus plains, we find a different possibility. A civilization that was vast, organized, and enduring. And one that, at least on the surface, left no trace of who was in charge. The question is not just who they were, the question is how they existed at all. If the discovery of the Indus Valley Civilization was expected, the structure of its cities was something else entirely. Because once the dust settled and the excavation maps began to take shape, it became clear this was not simply another ancient culture with familiar patterns. These were cities built according to the rules that appeared consistent, deliberate, and strangely modern. At Mohenjo-daro, the layout is unmistakable. Streets run in straight lines, intersecting at near perfect right angles. Blocks are rectangular, organized, and repeatable. This is not the organic sprawl seen in many early urban centers, where cities grow outward from a central temple or palace. This is planning, not improvised, not gradual, but designed. The same pattern appears at Harappa, hundreds of kilometers away. Different site, same logic. Streets aligned along cardinal directions, standardized construction, a shared architectural language extending across vast distances. This is not coincidence. It implies communication, agreement, and enforcement of standards on a scale that demands explanation. Because planning a single city is one thing, planning dozens across a region that is the size of a modern nation is something else entirely. And yet, the Indus cities do not present the usual mechanism behind such coordination. In other early civilizations, urban planning is often tied directly to centralized authority. In Ur, the ziggurat dominates the skyline, a physical and symbolic center around which the city organizes itself. In Giza, monumental architecture serves not only religious functions, but political ones, projecting the power of rulers whose authority is carved in stone. In the Indus cities, there is no equivalent. They are elevated areas, often referred to as citadels, but they do not function as palaces in any clear sense. They lack the grandeur, the decorative emphasis, the visual dominance associated with royal structures elsewhere. Instead, they contain large public works, platforms, storage areas, and in the case of Mohenjo-daro, the structure known as the Great Bath. The Great Bath is perhaps the closest thing the Indus civilization offers to a monumental feature. Constructed with carefully fitted bricks and sealed with bitumen to ensure water retention, it is a structure that required significant effort and coordination. Steps descend into a central pool, surrounding rooms suggest controlled access. Everything about it implies intention. But what was the intention that remains unclear. It may have been ritual, or it may have been social, it may have been both. What it does not appear to be is a monument to an individual. There are no inscriptions, no statues, no symbols linking it to a ruler or a dynasty. It stands alone, important but impersonal. And this pattern repeats. Residential buildings across the city show a remarkable level of consistency. Houses are constructed using standardized bricks, often arranged around central courtyards. Many include private wells, bathing areas, and access to the city's drainage system. This is not a city designed solely for elites. It suggests a level of urban provision that extends broadly across the population. The drainage system themselves are among the most striking features. Covered channels run beneath the streets, connected to household outlets, Inspection holes are built in, allowing for maintenance. Wastewater is directed away from the living areas with a level of engineering that, in some respects, would not be matched again for centuries. This is infrastructure designed not for display, but for function. And that raises a difficult question. Why does a civilization capable of such precision and coordination not invest in the visual language of power? Because that language is absent not just in monuments, but in the overall urban design. There is no clear central axis leading to a palace, no grand avenue lined with statues, no towering structure dominating the skyline. The cities are impressive, but their impressiveness lies in their order, not in their spectacle. Even the materials tell a part of the story. The use of the standardized bricks, often in a consistent ratio, suggests a sure system of measurement. This is not a local tradition, it's a regional one, maintained across distances that would require sustained interaction and agreement. Such standardization implies oversight. But oversight by whom? This is where the Indus cities begin to challenge conventional interpretations, because the level of coordination required to maintain these standards suggests some form of authority, some mechanism that ensures consistency across multiple settlements. Yet the authority does not manifest in the ways we expect. There are no administrative buildings clearly identifiable as centers of government, no archives filled with written records of decisions or decrees, no visual indicators of hierarchy embedded in the urban landscape. Instead, what we see is a system in which the rules appear to be embedded in the construction itself. The city does not point to power, it reflects it quietly, indirectly, through consistency rather than display. One possible interpretation is that the Indus civilization operated through a form of collective governance, an organized structure in which decisions were made not by a single ruler, but by groups or institutions that left fewer visible traces. Merchant classes, perhaps, or councils of elites, or whose authority was expressed through economic control rather than monumental architecture. Another possibility is that the system itself became the authority. The standardization, the measurement, and the shared practices created a form of order that did not require constant reinforcement through symbols of dominance. In such a model, power is less about visibility and more about stability. But again, these are interpretations. What the evidence shows is more limited, but no less striking. It shows cities that are planned, maintained, and interconnected. It shows infrastructure that prioritizes functionality over display. It shows a level of urban sophistication that stands alongside the greatest civilizations of the Bronze Age. And it shows all of this without the usual markers of centralized power. The absence begins to take on a different character here. It's no longer just a missing piece, it becomes part of the structure itself. Because the Indus cities are not simply lacking palaces or temples, they are built in a way that does not seem to require them at all. That is what makes them so difficult to interpret. In most ancient cities, hierarchy is visible. It is built into the layout, expressed through elevation, scale, and ornamentation. The powerful occupy the highest ground, the largest spaces, the most elaborate structures. The city itself becomes a map of power. In the Indus Valley, the map is harder to read. There are no differences in building size, certainly. Some houses are larger than others. Some areas are more elevated, but the distinctions are subtle. They do not produce a kind of stark contrast seen elsewhere between elite and non-elite spaces. This does not necessarily mean the society was equal. It means that if hierarchy existed, it was not expressed in the same architectural language. And that brings us back to the central tension. These cities should not exist in this form, at least not according to the models derived from other early civilizations. They are too organized to be accidental, too consistent to be uncoordinated, and too advanced to be considered primitive. And yet, they lack the features that are typically used to explain such organization. No kings, no palaces, no monuments to power. Just cities, ordered, functional, and silent. The question is no longer whether the Indus civilization was complex. That is beyond doubt. The question is what kind of complexity it represents. Because whatever system built these cities, it did so without leaving behind the usual signatures of authority. And that suggests something unsettling, that there may be more than one way for a civilization to organize itself, and that one of those ways leaves almost no trace of who was in control. The script and the seals, a silent language of power. If the cities of the Indus Valley challenge what we expect to see, the objects they leave behind deepen that challenge into something more unsettling, because scattered across these sites, small, precise, almost easily overlooked, are thousands of carved seals, and within these seals lies the closest thing this civilization has to a voice. They are not large objects. Most are only a few centimeters across, typically made from steatite, a soft stone that could be carved with fine detail and then hardened through firing. At first glance, they appear administrative, functional tools used for stamping goods, marking ownership, controlling trade, and that is almost certainly part of their purpose. But the more closely they are examined, and the more they resist being reduced to simple utility, each seal carries a combination of image and script. The image is usually dominant, a carefully rendered animal often shown in profile, bulls with exaggerated horns, elephants with deliberate anatomical detail, rhinoceroses, tigers, and creatures that do not clearly correspond to any known species. Above these figures runs a line of symbols, the Indus script, compact, standardized, and still undeciphered. This pairing is consistent across thousands of examples: image and text, symbol and sign, meaning clearly, but meaning that remains just out of reach. The script itself was one of the most persistent mysteries in ancient history. It appears in short sequences, rarely more than 5 or 6 signs, sometimes fewer. There are no long inscriptions, no extended texts, no obvious narrative content. This alone sets it apart from other early writing systems. For example, in cuneiform, even the earliest forms quickly expanded into administrative records, economic transactions, legal codes, and eventually literature. In Egyptian hieroglyphs, writing becomes monumental, covering temple walls, tombs, and stelae with layers of symbolic and phonetic meaning. The Indus script, however, does not behave in this way. It remains compact, controlled, repetitive, but not in a way that suggests simple labeling. There are patterns, certainly signs that appear frequently, others rarely, but without a bilingual inscription or longer texts, the system resists decipherment. Scholars have debated whether it represents a full writing system, a proto-writing system, or a symbolic code tied to administration and identity rather than language in a conventional sense. What is clear is that it is used widely and consistently. The signs are standardized across a vast geographic area, implying shared understanding. This was not a local or isolated system. It was part of the fabric of the Indus Valley Civilization. And then there are the images. The animals on the seal are not random decorations. They are rendered with intention, often with a level of stylization or suggests a symbolic meaning rather than the simple representation. The so-called unicorn motif, an animal with a single horn, often depicted standing before what appears to be a ritual object, is one of the most common. It does not correspond to any known animal, and yet it appears repeatedly, as if meaning was widely understood within this culture. Other seals depict more complex scenes. Among the most discussed is a figure seated in what appears to be a cross-legged posture surrounded by animals. And the figure is often interpreted as a proto-deity, sometimes associated uncautiously with later concepts such as Shiva in his aspect as Lord of Animals. But such identifications are highly speculative. What matters is the posture itself. The figure sits upright, legs bent, and positioned in a way that resembles advanced yogic postures, known from much later traditions. The arms rest on the knees, the body composed and controlled. This is not a casual position. It suggests discipline, intention, perhaps even a form of practice. Whether it represents meditation, ritual authority, or something else entirely is not known, but it is difficult to ignore familiarity of the pose when viewed through the lens of later South Asian traditions. And yet the Indus world offers no explanation. There are no accompanying texts to describe the figure, no inscriptions to identify it as a deity, a ruler, or a practitioner, no narratives that place it within a mythological framework. It exists as an image, precise, repeated, and silent. The combination of image and script raises a fundamental question about the Indus civilization: communicated meaning. Because while other societies left behind text that can be read, translated, and interpreted, the Indus Valley leaves behind a system that appears complete but inaccessible. It is not the script is random. It follows rules. It has structure. It shows sign of being a formalized system of communication. But without a key, without a magic Rosetta Stone or equivalent, it remains closed. Every attempt to decipher it has produced competing interpretations, none of which really have achieved consensus. And this has profound implications. Without readable texts, we cannot access the internal narratives of the civilization. We do not know their names for themselves, their cities, their leaders, if they had any. We do not know their myths, their laws, their histories. What we have instead are objects, material expressions of a system that functioned but did not explain itself in a way that survives. The seals in this context become more than administrative tools. They become fragments of a lost language, not just of words, but of symbols, identities, and possibly beliefs. They suggest a world in which meaning was encoded in ways that were understood by those within the system, but are now largely opaque. There is also the question of control. Seals are typically associated with authority, used to mark goods, verify transactions, establish ownership. In many societies, they are tied directly to administration and governance. And if this holds true for the Indus civilization, then the widespread use of seals implies a structured system of control, one that operated through standardized symbols and procedures. But again, the usual markers are absent. There are no seals bearing the names of kings, no titles, no clear hierarchies embedded in the inscriptions. The system seems to function without referring to individuals in the way other civilizations do, notably Mesopotamia. This suggests that identity within the system may have been tied to roles, groups, or institutions rather than singular rulers. Or it suggests something else entirely, that the symbols themselves carried authority, that the seal once impressed was sufficient enough, that the system did not require the constant reinforcement of named power because the structure was already accepted, internalized, and maintained through practice. This is where the Indus Valley begins to feel less like a missing piece of known history and more like a parallel development, one that followed its own logic, its own priorities, its own methods of organization. The script remains unread. The seals remain only partially understood. The images hint at meanings that cannot be fully recovered. And yet they are not chaotic, they are not primitive, they are precise, repeated, and integrated into a broader system that clearly worked. This is the contradiction. A civilization that communicates constantly but says nothing we can hear. A system of symbols that once carried meaning across cities and regions, now reduced to patterns without a translation. And within that system, images like the seated figure in its composed, almost familiar posture that suggest depth, practice, and even perhaps philosophy. But without words, those suggestions remain just that. The Indus Valley does not simply withhold its language. It leaves behind the structure of that language intact and visible, and then removes the key for us. The question is often asked too simply: were the people of the Indus Valley peaceful? It is a tempting idea, almost too clean to be trusted. A vast civilization that chose order over violence, trade over conquest, stability over expansion. But the real question is more precise and far more difficult to answer. Why does war not define these people? Because when placed alongside the other great civilizations of the Bronze Age, the contrast is immediate and unmistakable. In Mesopotamia, conflict is constant. City-states rise and fall in cycles of competition. Alliances shift. Kings boast of victories carved into clay and stone. Warfare is not incidental, it is central to identity. Power is proven through domination, and history is recorded as a sequence of conquests. In ancient Egypt, the pattern takes a different form, but the underlying principle remains. Military campaigns are documented, enemies are named and depicted, and rulers present themselves as protectors and conquerors, maintaining order through force when necessary. The imagery is explicit, the message is clear. The Indus Valley offers none of this. Across its cities, across Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and dozens of other sites, there is no visual culture of war, no battle scenes, no marching armies, no depictions of captured enemies or triumphant rulers. The seals, so carefully carved and widely distributed, do not show violence. They show animal symbols, composed figures, controlled imagery, but not conflict. Weapons have been found, but they are limited in number and form. Spears, blades, tools that serve multiple purposes. There's no clear evidence of specialized weapon production on a scale that would suggest organized warfare. There's no large caches of, no armories, no technological escalation in weapon design that typically accompany sustained conflict. The human remains tell a similar story. Skeletal traumas exist, but at a relatively low levels compared to other regions of the same period. There are injuries, certainly, signs of interpersonal violence, accidents perhaps, isolated conflicts, but not the widespread patterns associated with repeated warfare. This does not mean that violence was absent. It means that violence does not appear to have structured the civilization, and that distinction matters. Because war leaves traces even when texts are absent. It leaves fortifications, defensive structures, layers of destruction, patterns of rebuilding. In many ancient cities, walls are thickened, reinforced, redesigned in response to threat. Gates are narrowed, access is controlled, strategic positions are fortified. In the Indus cities, this pattern is inconsistent at best. Some sites do have walls or elevated sections, often referred to as citadels, but their function is not clearly military. In many cases, they appear to serve as platforms, possibly for public works, storage, or administrative activities. The walls themselves are not always designed for defense. They lack the features typically associated with fortification. No clear evidence of battlements, no signs of siege damage, no consistent orientation toward external threats. In a landscape shaped by rivers that flood and shift, it's entirely possible that many of these structures were built as much for environmental management as for protection. The Indus people appear to have engineered their cities to control water. Definitely hydraulic engineering takes precedence. To manage seasonal changes, to stabilize their environment. If they built defenses, then they may have built them against nature first. And this is where the pattern begins to shift. Because when we look beyond what is missing and focus on what is present, a different structure of power begins to emerge. Not one based on conquest, but one based on control of systems. The Indus civilization was deeply integrated into long-distance trade networks. Its goods, beads, ceramics, textiles, and possibly metals moved across regions, reaching as far as Mesopotamia, where references to a land called Malua are widely interpreted as pointing to the Indus world. This is not peripheral trade. It was sustained, organized, and recognized by other major civilizations.
Trade requires trust. It requires standardization, predictability, and enforcement of agreements. And in the Indus Valley, we see precisely those elements. Weights and measures are standardized across vast distances. Seals are used to mark goods, to identify origin, to regulate exchange. The same systems appear in city after city, suggesting not just shared culture, but shared rules. So this is not a pattern of competing states locked in cycles of conflict. It is a pattern of a network in which coordination matters more than domination. The bricks themselves reinforce this idea. Across the Indus region, fired bricks are produced in consistent ratios, typically following a 1:4 proportion. This level of standardization is not trivial. It implies agreement on measurement, on production, on construction methods, maintained across hundreds of kilometers. In Mesopotamia, brick construction is common, but it varies. Cities develop independently. Materials differ. Rebuilding is frequent, often in response to conflict or environmental degradation. But the Indus cities, by contrast, show a remarkable continuity. The materials are consistent, the layouts are stable, the system holds true. This suggests a different kind of resilience, not one based on a defensive strength, but on internal coherence. If war was not the primary mechanism for securing resources or territory, then something else must have taken its place. Trade is the obvious candidate. But trade alone does not maintain order across a civilization of this scale. It must be supported by systems that regulate behavior, enforce standards, and resolve conflict before it escalates. So what we may be seeing in the Indus Valley is a form of control that operates without the need for constant physical enforcement, a system in which stability is maintained through integration, economic, material, and perhaps social, rather than through visible displays of power. This does not eliminate conflict, it just reduces its visibility. And that is the important distinction. Because one of the risks in interpreting the Indus Valley Civilization is the tendency to project modern ideals onto it, to imagine it as uniquely peaceful, as an early example of society that rejected violence altogether. The evidence does not support such a conclusion. There are signs of stress, particularly in the later phases of the civilization. Some sites show indications of disruption, abandonment, and possibly internal instability. But even in these phases, the pattern does not shift toward militarization in any obvious way. There is no sudden proliferation of weapons, no emergence of fortified strongholds, no clear transition to a war-driven society. What remains consistent is the absence of war as identity. In other Bronze Age civilizations, war is not just practiced, it is celebrated. It is a recorded event, displayed and embedded into the cultural narrative. It becomes part of how societies define themselves. And the Indus Valley Civilization does not do this. And that may be the most significant difference of all, because it suggests that whatever conflicts did occur were not elevated to the level of defining experience. They were not based on a political legitimacy. They were not the primary means through which power was expressed or maintained. Instead, it appears to have been embedded in the system itself, in the ability to coordinate, to standardize, to connect distant regions into a functioning whole. This is not a weak form of organization. It is, in many ways, a highly efficient one. But it is also a difficult one to interpret, because it leaves fewer traces of the kind historians are trained to recognize. There are no conquest narratives to reconstruct, no lists of battles to analyze, no monuments to decode as statements of military power. There's only the system and the silence around how it was maintained. A civilization of this scale should leave scars of violence. It should show signs of struggle, of expansion, of resistance. It should tell us in one way or another how it defended itself, how it projected its power, how it dealt with these threats. But the Indus Valley, it does not tell that story. It leaves behind cities that functioned, networks that connected, and systems that endured. but almost no evidence that war was the force that held it together. And that absence is not easy to explain, because it suggests Indus did not build its world through conquest. It built it through something else. There is a moment in the life of most civilizations when everything becomes visible. The final war, the last ruler, the destruction layer burned into the ground. History, even in ruin, tends to leave a signature, a clear indication that something ended. The Indus Valley does not give us that moment. There is no final battle, no widespread burn layer, no empire collapsing under invasion. Instead, what emerges from the archaeological record is something far more difficult to grasp. The cities do not fall, they are slowly, methodically abandoned. Not in panic, not in chaos, but in a way that suggests a long drawn out unraveling. At sites like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, the evidence points not to destruction but to neglect. Drainage systems that once required constant maintenance begin to clog and fail. Streets, once aligned and kept clear, accumulate debris. Buildings are subdivided, altered, and repurposed. The precision of the earlier phases gives way to improvisation. Order does not collapse, it decays. And then gradually the cities are left behind. What replaces them is not another centralized power, but fragmentation. Smaller settlements, rural communities. The population remains, but the system that once held it together, urban planning, standardization, long-distance coordination, begins to dissolve. This is not the disappearance of a people. It is the disappearance of a way of organizing life. The question is why that system stopped working. For a long time, explanations focused on invasion or internal conflict, as previously described. But as evidence accumulated, those explanations began to fail. There is no consistent sign of large-scale violence, no pattern of destruction that would suggest a military takeover, regional conflicts. Instead, attention turned to something less visible but far more pervasive: the climate. The Indus civilization was built on water. It was a hydraulic civilization, not just access to rivers like the Indus River, but on the predictability of seasonal monsoons that sustained agriculture across the region. And these monsoon cycles were not incidental. They were the foundation of everything. Crops, trade, urban density, and stability all depended on their regular return. And then something changed. Around 4,200 years ago, at roughly the same time that other major Bronze Age civilizations began to experience stress, the monsoon system appears to have weakened dramatically. Evidence for this not from written records, but because none exist, but from the chemistry of ancient environments. At a site called Kotla Dahar, an ancient lake basin in northern India, researchers led by paleoclimatologist Yama Dixit examined sediment layers to reconstruct past climate conditions. Using carbon dating, radiocarbon dating, and then isotopic analysis of snail shells preserved in the sediment, they were able to measure changes in the ratio of oxygen isotopes, specifically oxygen 18 and oxygen 16. This matters because of how water behaves. During periods of drought, lighter oxygen 16 evaporates more easily, leaving behind water enriched in the heavier oxygen 18 isotope. And when lake organisms form shells from that water, they preserve this ratio. So by measuring it, scientists can infer how wet or dry conditions were at the same time the shells formed. And what they found was striking. Between approximately 4,200 and 4,000 years ago, there was a sharp increase in oxygen 18 levels, evidence of a sustained period of reduced rainfall, not a brief fluctuation, but a prolonged event. And the data suggests that the summer monsoon, the primary source of rainfall for the region, weakened severely, possibly even failing for nearly 2 centuries. A 200-year drought, not an immediate catastrophe, but something arguably more destabilizing. A long, slow disruption of environmental rhythm on which the entire civilization depended. This finding aligns with broader patterns observed across the ancient world. Around the same period, civilizations in Mesopotamia, the Eastern Mediterranean, and even parts of ancient Egypt show signs of stress linked to aridification. This is sometimes referred to as the 4.2 kiloyear event, climatic shift that appears to have affected multiple regions simultaneously. But the Indus response was different. Where other civilizations show signs of conflict, reorganization, or political collapse, the Indus Valley shows a gradual withdrawal. As the monsoon weakened, agricultural output would have become less reliable. Crop failures may not have been immediate or total, but over time, the margin for sustaining large urban populations would have definitely been narrowed. And at the same time, river systems were changing. The Gagar-Hakra River, which once supported numerous settlements, appears to have diminished or shifted, further reducing water availability in key areas. The landscape itself was becoming less predictable. For a civilization built on standardization and stability, this posed a fundamental problem. The Indus system worked because it was consistent. Bricks were uniform, cities were planned, trade was regulated, water was managed. But when the environment itself becomes inconsistent, those environmental systems begin to strain. Adaptation becomes necessary, but large integrated systems are often less flexible than smaller ones. This is where the process begins to accelerate. As agricultural yields declined, trade networks were weakened. As trade weakened, the standardized systems that depended on it, weights, measures, seal-based identification, would have lost their relevance. As those systems broke down, the incentive to maintain large urban centers diminished. The cities did not collapse because they were attacked. They became unnecessary. As people moved, well, not all at once, but under duress, but gradually, adjusting to new conditions, smaller communities, less dependent on centralized infrastructure, would have been more resilient in a changing environment. The shift from urban to rural life was not a retreat, it was an adaptation. And yet, even within this framework, something remains unresolved, because we do not know how the people of the Indus Valley understood what was happening to them. The script remains undeciphered. The seals remain untranslated. There are no texts describing failed harvests, shifting rivers, or declining trade. No records of decisions made or strategies attempted or explanations offered. We're looking at the external consequences of internal experiences, and that are completely inaccessible. Did they recognize the drought as a temporary disruption or as a permanent change? Did they attempt to maintain the cities longer than they were sustainable? Or did they debate, reorganize, or resist, or simply adapt as conditions required? We do not know. What we do know, though, is the process did not produce the kind of ending we expect. There was no singular moment of collapse. There wasn't a definitive break. Instead, there was a gradual transition from one form of life to another. The system that defined the Indus civilization, its cities, its standardization, its networks, ceased to function, but the people continued, reshaping their existence in response to a world that had changed around them. And that may be the most unsettling aspect of all, because it suggests that civilizations do not always end in a visible catastrophe. They can disappear through transformation, through the slow loss of the conditions that made them possible in the first place. The Indus Valley did not leave behind a story of its fall. It left behind the physical remains of a system that once operated with precision and coherence, and the silent evidence of a world where, for 200 years, the rains didn't come.